This is another study that I am presenting on behalf of a really excellent team of co-authors. And this one looks at migrant domestic workers in the UK in partnership with a support group that's run by migrant domestic workers for migrant domestic workers. And in terms of the existing literature, one thread that we're picking up on is on bystanders in the smart home. So an increasing amount of literature is looking at not what are called so-called primary users, the people who purchase technology, but also secondary users who are affected by it. We do have some problems with this framing because bystanders tends to imply that people are there on accident, like a passerby in the street. Where what we found, and what's even reflected in terms like nanny cams, is that domestic workers in the home are often a primary subject of surveillance and not just coincidentally being recorded. And in fact, a lot of existing security research, if it mentions domestic workers at all, which is rare, tends to frame them as a kind of threat. Which you can see, I think the most egregious example is called the evil Maid threat model, which many of you are probably familiar with, but involves a kind of scenario where there's a businessman in a hotel room and his device is compromised by an evil maid who uses something like a USB flash drive, and then he comes back, enters his password, which is sent to the evil maid. Which, given kind of the extent to which domestic workers and people in the hospitality industry are disproportionately less powerful than people like businessmen or government officials, the extent to which this kind of work is racialized and gendered and generally has very low labor protection and high levels of sexual harassment, I think the fact that we have a body of literature that's dedicated to protecting against the evil maid, but not really a body of literature protecting domestic workers, points to these broader patterns where security research is heavily invested in protecting those who are already powerful and probably likely to be threats to other people. So another area of research that we're drawing on is looking at power dynamics in privacy and security. There have been calls for more inclusive privacy and security that focuses on marginalized groups and recognition of differential vulnerabilities. There's been some work on workplace surveillance, which is obviously very relevant to this, and there's been a lot of work on surveillance, and particularly surveillance of migrants. So really important context for the group that we're working with in particular is the set of hostile environment policies that were implemented in the UK in 2012, which took away a lot of the rights that migrant domestic workers had, leaving them on these very short-term visas that are tied to having an employer in the country. Which essentially leaves them vulnerable to a lot of different kinds of labor exploitation as well as sexual harassment, because if you aren't able to find an employer, then you are deported, and so that gives you a lot less bargaining power to leave an abusive employer. These are compounded by loopholes in a lot of labor laws, which often don't protect domestic workers because their place of employment is someone else's home, and so that home is then protected as a private space. So the methods that we used in this paper is a relatively new combination of threat modeling and participatory research, which I've called participatory threat modeling. And so what this form of threat modeling does is it invites participants to define their own threats in this really open-ended way that doesn't focus on a specific device or a specific threat actor, but tries to center participants' experiences of what makes them feel unsafe. We started out with a variety of online workshops. Once we developed a privacy guide, we also did some in-person workshops sharing that guide. And we also did desk-based research that would be sort of led by participants' own questions. So if participants would ask us questions about privacy and security, and if we didn't know the answers, we would do desk-based research to answer that. And a lot of this was based on this partnership with a group called Voice of Domestic Workers, which is a really fantastic support group in the UK based in London. And they collaborated with us, or the peer researcher as well as other members of the organization collaborated on all steps of the project. That included defining research questions, collecting data, analyzing data, and then disseminating the digital privacy guide and co-authoring this paper. So I think in terms of positionality, that was incredibly valuable to help us sort of remain grounded in what people's concerns were and have people who have the sort of job description or life role of being community organizers join us on the research team. And here's some kind of placards from a protest organized by Voice of Domestic Workers. And here is the digital privacy guide, which you can look up, which we created specifically for domestic workers and migrant domestic workers in the UK on the basis of all of our workshops. This kind of project raises a lot of ethical concerns, so we tried to minimize that through data minimization. We didn't record any audio and used handwritten notes, which were then destroyed, so there's no way to connect anything anyone said to their identities. We had the peer researcher present to minimize risk of re-traumatization and as well as harms around extractive research and collaboration. I'm realizing that my timekeeping on this one has not been very strong, so I'm gonna go faster. So the threat model perceived by migrant domestic workers ended up being quite surprising, which I think is an indication of how this method works, because we had expected this project to be primarily about employers, but most the kind of threats that were prioritized highest by our participants were government surveillance and the Home Office, followed by online scams and harassment, which they're disproportionately targeted by, and then employer monitoring. So government surveillance was incredibly pervasive in people's lives, affecting, for example, their ability to get COVID tests or COVID vaccinations because they were living with undocumented people and didn't want the Home Office to come and investigate, which clearly has knock-on effects not just to their health, but sort of to everyone's collective health when you have things like the healthcare system sharing data with the immigration system, which has happened in the UK. There's divided opinions on employer monitoring, with some people seeing it like a trap, some people reporting CCTV cameras stopping them from leaving abusive employment, while other people seeing it as a form of defense, saying things like the child is the camera and it's worse when people are reporting on you and maybe you can use this in your own self-defense. And lastly, there was pervasive problems with online scams and harassment, which targeted people along their identities as domestic workers, as women. For example, people putting up ads asking for a girlfriend as well as a cleaner, or threatening to report people to the police if they were turned down on a date, for example. So these different kinds of threats are connected and reinforcing. People's precarious immigration status makes them fundamentally more vulnerable to things like online scams and labor exploitation and interpersonal abuse, which is where our work is heavily influenced by the theory of intersectionality and these different power approaches to security. So we argue that security research has to consider these broader structures like gendered work, like racialized border policy, which create a lot of insecurity. Because vulnerability doesn't come only from insecure technology, but sort of these broader structures. And echoing previous research, community support is a really key source of safety reported by our participants. Legal and structural reform as a result is necessary for safety. I'm going to gloss over the specifics because we're in the US, and so this is perhaps less relevant here, but this is something we go into it further in the paper. And we also have a set of methodological recommendations. So again, similarly to the previous study, you can build with these existing community sources of safety and trust, particularly using things like participatory action research. But it's important to be wary of extractive modes of research, which kind of use participants as a way to get data and publications, but aren't reciprocal, or maybe even create harm for participants. One way to do that is to create pragmatic resources for participants. There's a lot of remaining work to be done that we are continuing to do on, for example, disseminating the guide that we've made in workshops. And lastly, we do end with a series of design implications. So for example, balancing the needs of device owners and other stakeholders, being aware that the sort of device owner might be a perpetrator of abuse, both in sort of terms of like intimate partner abuse, but also towards people that they're, people working in their home. Trying to minimize opportunities for covert surveillance, making privacy settings more accessible. Again, I think there's a lot of remaining research that could be done in understanding nudges for ethical device use, reminding people, for example, that it's illegal to record in a bedroom or a bathroom, reminding people to get active consent for recording. And then lastly, but incredibly importantly, I think as a research community, security research needs to have a reckoning with how our own research is being used to develop these harmful surveillance systems and to like stop that from within, so to speak. This is one of the only publicly available bits of information on the actual legal protections, and it's offered by a spy equipment website in the UK. So there's clearly a need for like better and more accurate information on people's rights vis-a-vis surveillance, and I think that's an area where research can be helpful. So to conclude, things like racism, sexism, labor precarity, and border control are really serious sources of insecurity. We can look to and bolster communities as a source of security, and we can do sort of research based on these kinds of principles of solidarity and partnership. And as our peer researcher said, instead of becoming victims trapped in hidden surveillance, communities such as those of migrant domestic workers can be active participants in creating a safer digital world. Thank you.